Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Wednesday lunchtime seminar. And I'd like to welcome both the people in the room and those who are joining us via live stream. Before we start formally, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the custodians, owners of the land on which we're having our meeting today, and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and welcome any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. You're all encouraged to follow or add to the conversation on social media using hashtag George Talks and any other hashtags you'd like. It is my privilege today to welcome a very special guest that we have speaking, who's been with the Institute for about 3 days. I should also acknowledge support we've had from the Bupa Health Foundation in bringing Londa to us from Stanford University. Londa is the John L. Hines Professor of History of Science at Stanford University. I know we don't usually have professors of history come and speak to us today, so I think that's a double pleasure for us to have somebody from an entirely different disciplinary focus. Londa currently directs the Gendered Innovations in Science, Health and Medicine, Engineering and Environment project. I think it is fair to say that Londa has been hugely influential in the whole area of gendered innovations across the STEM area. I've known about Londa's work for quite some time, as have numerous others who have been meeting Londa over the last couple of days. And as you'll hear from Londa's presentation, it's a fascinating area. It's some of which overlaps directly with the sorts of things that we've been involved in, but some goes beyond that. And I think every time I hear Londa, I learn something else, which is fascinating. I don't know if we're going to hear about mice and men, but maybe we will. But if Londa doesn't tell us about mice and men, we'll tell you about it later because it's some fascinating sort of material. But Londa has a very detailed background bio that some of you may have already read. I won't go into it at all. Suffice to say, we are very privileged to have Londa here. Londa joined a few of us yesterday talking about a particular piece of research that we've been undertaking here, which has been looking at the Australian medical funding agencies, medical journals, and their current policies and practices with respect to sex and gendered analyses of data. And so we brought together some key players across Australia working in this area to discuss those findings and move towards implementing such policies. So it was fantastic to have Londa here at that meeting yesterday to learn from what's happened in North America and Europe. But Londa has a bigger agenda immediately after that. Today, we're off to the New South Wales Engineering to talk to engineers about gendered innovations in mechanical engineering, AI and robotics. So just to give you a sense of Londa's very broad perspective on things. But let me stop now and move to introducing Londa. Thank you so much, Londa. We look forward to your presentation.
And I've been enjoying your botanical garden with all the beautiful birds and plants and trees. And I even taught Robin what some of your trees are here in Australia. So today we're going to talk about gendered innovations. And Gendered Innovations was produced through a large international collaboration involving the European Commission, the US National Science Foundation, and Stanford University. And we've now expanded into South Korea and into South Africa, and we're very active in Canada as well. And then since Stanford is located right in Silicon Valley, we have, I would say, expanded into Silicon Valley. The last few years, we've had a series of tech roundtables with some of the companies there, like Google and Facebook. Innovations is about integrating sex and gender analysis into the design of research.
Sorry, Londa, we're just having a few technical problems.
Oh. Okay. So Gendered Innovations is about integrating sex and gender analysis into the design of research. And I was very excited about what was going on yesterday because this is really important. As I hope you'll see from my talk, there are some very important aspects to this. So the operative question is, how can we harness the creative power of sex and gender analysis for discovery? Does considering gender add a valuable dimension to research? Does it take research in new directions? So just a bit of background. Governments and universities in the US and Western Europe have taken 3 strategic approaches to gender equality over the past several decades. And I call these the 3 fixes. Fix the numbers of women, which focuses on increasing the numbers of women in science and engineering. The second is Fix the Institutions, which is about promoting gender equality in careers through structural change in research organizations. And the third is Fix the Knowledge, or Gendered Innovations, which stimulates excellence in science and medicine by integrating sex and gender analysis into research. And of course, we academics like to take things apart, but we know that in reality, all of these work together. And we just had a paper published in Nature Human Behavior, my postdoc and I, which shows that using 1.5 million medical papers, I should say that's my postdoc's work, we showed that there is a connection between at least number 1 and number 3 of those 3 fixes. We found a link. People usually think, okay, we increase the number of women first and then we think about making new knowledge. But we found that the reverse may also be true. For policymakers, our findings demonstrate an important empirical link between increasing the number of women in academic medicine and enhancing excellence in research by incorporating sex and gender analysis. So my short talk today will focus completely on this third aspect, fixing the knowledge. It's the newest area and the most important for the future of science, medicine, and innovation. And this is what Gendered Innovations is all about. So let's dive in. Doing research wrong costs lives and money. For example, 10 drugs were withdrawn from the US market between 1997 and 2000 because of life-threatening health effects, and 8 of those posed greater threats for women. Not only did these drugs cost billions of dollars to create, but when they failed, they caused human death and suffering. We can't afford to get the research wrong. But doing research right can save lives and money, and I'm very interested in this kind of metric, this kind of analysis of research. This is an analysis of the US Women's Health Initiative hormone therapy trial, which was done in the 1990s. It was a big trial to see whether postmenopausal women should take estrogen supplements or not. The findings were so remarkable that the trial was stopped midstream because they realized they were harming people. So the answer is no, you should not take supplemental estrogen after menopause. But interestingly, they found that for every dollar spent for the research, $140 were returned to the US taxpayer in healthcare savings. And this research also saved lives. There were fewer cardiovascular disease incidences, fewer breast cancers, and more quality adjusted year lives. And the downside is that there were more osteoporotic fractures. So it's crucially important to get the research right from the very beginning. And this is the goal of Gendered Innovations. This project develops state-of-the-art methods of sex and gender analysis, and we provide case studies or concrete examples of how gender analysis leads to discovery and innovation. And I'll discuss a few of these findings with you this afternoon. Now, first, to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm sure you all know what sex and gender is, though I could give you a quiz and then we'd see if you really know or not. But I really like this image from Vera Brigitza-Grosek, who is a leader of gender medicine she's in Berlin and works on gender. The Europeans call it gender medicine. I don't really like that term, but nonetheless, she works on gender medicine across Europe. And sex, of course, is biological characteristics like genes, sex hormones, and gender is any of the social aspects, the social attitudes and behaviors that men and women hold, the behaviors that shape your life and shape your health. So she's focusing on nutrition and lifestyle, but it could be education or ethnicity or socioeconomic status. And her point is that these factors interact through the lifetime, the life course, to give you a health outcome as an adult. So today I'm going to talk a lot about men and women and males and females, but I want to point out that there is a huge diversity of gender practices, behaviors, and attitudes. There's nothing inborn about gender, so we can change. We can kind of take on whatever characteristics and behaviors we would like to take on. Maybe I'm being a little assertive and not particularly feminine. My kids think I'm not feminine at all, but so we want to remember that while the majority of the population is male and female, there are people who are intersex. I like to say that sex is on a spectrum from male to female. It's very hard to operationalize that in research, but I think we have to start thinking about that. In the United States, we've just had a study a year or so ago that found that about 0.6% of the population is transgender, which is only one kind of gender that is not, masculine or feminine, but that turns out to be nearly 2 million people. And things like gender fluid, we don't know. I mean, people haven't done studies and we don't know. I would certainly like to know. So let's go back to why some of these drugs failed, why the 10 drugs failed that were withdrawn from the market. And there are many reasons why drugs fail and fail more often for women. And one reason is that a lot of research is still done in males, whether humans, animals, or cells and tissues. And to demonstrate that, I take a study that was done by some of our colleagues at Berkeley in 2011. And this shows the sex of the animals used in laboratory research in these particular fields. And you can see that the males dominate, except for two areas, which is immunology and reproduction. But what I'm interested in is this gray area here where the sex of the animal was not recorded. If you don't record the sex of your animal, you really can't use this data in any meaningful way. The same is true for cells and tissues. And here the story is just gray area, right? The sex of the cell is almost never recorded. This is research money wasted. You might as well throw it out the window because you can't really know anything about sex differences. So that's 2011, and you would think, oh, well, she's showing such old data. How can that be? This is the most recent data from 2014, and this shows when sex is considered as a biological variable in research, in published research, and you can see it's a very small proportion here, and it's basically completely flat. Now, in the United States, we have, in 2016, we put in a requirement that to receive public funding, taxpayer money, you have to say how sex analysis functions in your research. And so we're hoping for a spike here. We're hoping that this kind of research will become mainstream. So now I want to take you, now I'm going to talk about the mice and the men, the story that Robin loves. And this is how it really matters. Now, I know you're all ace researchers, right? So you know how to disaggregate data by sex, and you know how to use representative sexes in your research, and you know how to analyze that research. But I want to tell you another thing. It's complicated and it's creative, and we have to get all of the aspects right. And this is animal research again, and my point here is that we can't just look at the sex of the two animals, whether it's a male or female, what kind of animal it is. We have to look at the dynamics in the lab, and we know that the biology of the animal will be impacted by its environment. So things that are important are how the animals are caged, the social dynamics in the lab, the room temperature, the kind of diet the animal has. And what I want to talk about is the interaction between the research staff and the animal. So it's an interaction, and you can decide if it's a sex interaction or a gender interaction. I'll leave that up to you. This is an important study by someone named Zorg et al. It came out of Jeff Mogul's lab in Canada, and this lab studies pain. They're doing pain research. They induce pain in rats and mice, and then they want to know how the animal expresses its pain. That's what they're looking for. And they have, it's all very objective. They have grimace charts. If you don't do this kind of work, they have grimace charts so that you know how you go to the doctor and they ask you what's your pain, 1 to 10? Well, the animals are scored as well with these grimace charts, so they can tell very well how the animal is expressing its pain. Now, in this study, they found that animals don't show their pain when a man is in the room. So it matters who's doing the research. The animals are happy to show their pain if it's an empty room. They're happy to show their pain if a woman is in the room. They're happy to show their pain if there's a cardboard cutout in the room. So then the researchers did all the possible conditions. Is it just something in the room? But it was very clearly, both the male and the female animals had the same response. They did not show their pain when a man is in the room. And the researchers called this the male observer effect. It's very well known to anthropologists, right? This kind of interaction between the subject and the people being studied. So the researchers identified this as the male observer effect. So what's going on? It's not how the researchers act or how they handle the animals, though that can be a factor. What it is that the animals smell the men. They smell the male pheromones. And according to Jeff Mogul's, whose lab this came out of, this phenomenon throws into question all pain research. And it's at the beginning of the pain research cycle. So we have to be very clever when we're doing our research and understand all the factors that are influencing the research. These kinds of things are very important, and in biomedicine now, it's clear that sex analysis is incredibly important to the research. So Lancet, just in December 2016, put in new guidelines. If you want to publish in Lancet, you have to go through these different steps. It's pretty straightforward. But again, we're smarter than that, and we know that we need to consider, even though they don't ask for environmental factors, such as the interaction of the sex of the researcher, we know that we would need to look at all of these kinds of factors. So that's sex. But in human research, gender is a cultural variable across the lifespan and is also very important. We know that sex and gender interacts in humans to determine their health outcomes over a lifetime. If we only focus on sex, we're only seeing half of the equation. So we need to understand gender and how that also impacts health. The problem is that we lack instruments to understand gender in clinical trials. I'm from the social sciences and the humanities. For us, gender is incredibly complicated. But if we really want to use gender in clinical trials, we have to have some kind of instruments that we can manipulate quantitatively so that we can factor these gender aspects into the research. So at Stanford, we're trying to develop an instrument like this. We call our instrument Gender Variables in Health Research. We were inspired. We started this study 2 years ago. It has not been easy, let me tell you. But we've just about got our manuscript together, and we're just about finished. We were inspired by a study that came out of Canada in 2015, and this came out of Louise Pillett's lab. We thought it was extremely innovative in finding a way to reduce the complex issues of gender to measurable variables. The Canadian team studied acute coronary syndrome and wanted to know why some patients have higher incidence of recurrence and death after 12 months after diagnosis, who they were, and what the doctors could do about it. So to do the study, the PIs reduced sex to a variable. That's straightforward, but they found no difference between males and females for acute coronary syndrome and who would relapse in the course of 12 months. So they also reduced gender to component variables. After testing 17 variables, they found 7 factors that were significant and developed a gender-related score. And I like a lot of these factors here. They're looking at the number of hours per week spending doing housework. That's a good health outcome kind of factor, right? They looked at the level of stress at home, who has the primary income, and then they used the BIM sex role inventory masculinity and femininity score. And that's where we started to raise our eyebrows a little bit. And these 7 factors, they then controlled for sex, age, the GRACE score, which is important for cardiovascular disease, and the history of smoking, obesity, all the kinds of factors that you would look at. So the result of their study was that sex made no difference, but gender mattered. The patients received a gender-related score from 1 to 100, and the patients with a higher femininity score, regardless whether they were men or women, were more likely to experience a recurrence of acute coronary syndrome. So we thought that is incredibly important, but we were looking into these factors and how well does this work. Now you have to remember that Canada put into effect a policy asking for sex and gender analysis in all publicly funded health research in 2010. So the Canadians are trying to fulfill this obligation and look at gender as a very important aspect of health. But in so doing, doctors tend to take ready-made gender scales off the shelf and plug them into their research. And here, this team used the BIM sex role inventory masculinity and femininity score. And I have to say that is an instrument that was developed in 1974. Okay, we're studying gender, and this was developed in 1974 at Stanford, however bizarre that is. And at that time, the Stanford population was very white, very privileged, and extremely athletic. It still is extremely athletic, but we've now diversified a lot, and people, I suppose, are still pretty privileged. But anyway, this score is invalid, completely invalid. So we were looking for a way to, we were inspired by their impulse, but we didn't think that their instrument was a good one. So what we did at Stanford is we're trying to move beyond the binary notions of masculinity and femininity by developing variables that capture specific social behaviors related to gender. And we're scoring those as human behaviors. They are behaviors that have traditionally divided between men and women, but they are human behaviors, and you do not get a masculinity or femininity. I'm trying to get rid of these ideas of masculinity and femininity. They're boxes. We keep boxing people in to these horrible ideas. And I'm a historian. I can tell you exactly where those ideas came from. They're 18th century Enlightenment ideas, and they result from the fact that women were not given the vote in the American Revolution or in the French Revolution. And they have a very, very bad history. We need to get rid of them. So in our instrument that we're developing now, we have, I don't know why it's 7, we both ended up with 7, but anyway, we want to measure, we found factors that are important for gender norms, which are the social pressures that impact people's behaviors, gender identity, and gender relations. And we chose these, we didn't choose, we worked out these 7 factors, and we have tested them in 2 populations of 2,000 each, and that's what we're going to release on the world pretty soon. So there will be a way to look at gender. This is valid for the US, for perhaps Western Europe, probably Australia, anywhere that the Europeans colonized, let's put it that way. So now there's much we could say about biomedical research, but I'm going to move on and give you a little view of what's happening in other parts of the gender world, just for fun. And I'm going to talk about AI, and I'm going to talk a little bit about robots, because the robots are coming and we should be prepared. And they're really coming in the biomedical space. They're coming as assistive technologies for the elderly, trying to keep people in their homes longer, and that sort of thing. So first I want to talk about machine learning, specifically about machine learning. And now I'm going to go to my extremely cool website where everything is loaded up and you can use this as a resource. We have our 12 methods of sex and gender analysis here, which I'm not going to talk about, terms, checklists for research, that sort of thing. Then we have our case studies or our examples in these 4 buckets of science, health and medicine, engineering, and environment. And what I want to talk about right now is machine translation, or in fact, more specifically, Google Translate. I can pick on Google because they're about 20 minutes from Stanford, and they were developed at Stanford. So I start with a story. A couple of years ago, I was in Madrid and interviewed by some Spanish newspapers. And I read a number of European languages, but not Spanish. So when I got home, I zoomed the articles through Google Translate to see what they were saying about me. And I was shocked that I was referred to repeatedly as he, Londa Schiebinger. He says, he thought, or it wrote. So how can a company, a cool company like Google, make such a fundamental error? Google Translate defaults to the masculine pronoun because he said appears more often on the internet than she said. So the ratio of the masculine to the feminine pronoun was at 4-to-1 throughout this period, peaking in 1968, and then dropped dramatically through a huge process of cultural change to 2-to-1 in 2010. So what else happened in this period from 68 to 2010? What are some of the things that happened in culture? Feminism, the women's movement, our National Science Foundation started putting money into encouraging women into science and engineering and into medicine. It was a huge cultural revolution. All of the newscasters use he and she, the presidents, well, maybe not this one. Most of our presidents use inclusive language like he and she. So with one algorithm, Google wiped out 40 years of cultural change, but they didn't mean to. It was completely unconscious gender bias. So the fix, a couple of years ago, Gendered Innovations held a workshop, and we invited people from Google. We invited natural language processing experts from Google and from Stanford, and they listened for about 20 minutes, and they got it, and they said, oh, we can fix that. But it was such a cool problem that they were emailing under the table back to their lab, cool problem, cool problem. So fixing is great, but constantly retrofitting for women is not the best road forward. I had to ask myself, how is it that the Google engineers, many of whom are educated at Stanford, could make such a simple mistake? What are we doing at Stanford wrong? For one thing, we don't teach gender analysis in the core engineering curriculum. Yes, you can come over to the history department and take all kinds of cool courses on gender from me and my colleagues, but we are not where the engineers live. We are not teaching it in the core engineering curriculum. And I have to say the same problem is at our medical school. We are not teaching sex and gender analysis in our medical school, and I don't think you are very much here in Australia either. So again, products can be fixed, but what if Apple, Google, and other companies started product development research by incorporating gender analysis? What innovative new technologies, softwares, and systems could be conceived? So the point I want to make is that this unconscious gender bias from the past amplifies gender inequalities into the future. It's actually very important because now we have a woman actor. I am the actor, but I am being seen as a he, and therefore the percentage of he's is going to go up again in the data. So not only do we perpetuate the gender inequality, but we amplify the gender inequality. When trained on historical data, as Google Translate is, the system inherits bias, including gender bias. And when the Translate program defaults to he said, it again increases the relative frequency of the masculine pronoun on the web and may reverse our hard-won advances toward gender equal language. So it turns out that even though Google wanted to fix the problem, they haven't been able to. I think it's always harder to fix something once a basic platform is set. And importantly, Google Translate is creating the future. Technology, that is to say our devices, our programs and processes, shape human attitudes, behaviors, and culture. In other words, past bias is perpetuated into the future even when governments, universities, and companies, such as Google itself, have implemented policies to foster equality. So the big question is, how can we humans intervene in these automated processes to create the society that we want? Now, since this case study, there are many examples like this Google Translate problem, and I'll just give you a couple of those examples now. We see that in a lot of machine learning and a lot of algorithms, the bias that is in the data is returned to you. So for example, Google search. If you are searching for a high-paying job, which in this case is $200,000 or US dollars or more, men are 5 times more likely than women to be offered ads for these high-paying jobs. Why is that? The algorithm is optimized to get the ad to the right person. And knowing that men make more money than women as a group, the men are likely to get these ads. Another example, a different kind of example that we have here is word embedding. So word embedding captures associations between words that perpetuate harmful stereotypes, such as man and computer programmer versus woman and homemaker. So word embedding is a technology, if you think of words as in vector space, they can understand, the word embedding understands the geometry, the relationship between the words in space, and therefore it sees these kinds of associations. If we don't intervene, the 1950s will be returned to you over and over again with man, the computer programmer, and woman, the homemaker. So I have a very clever colleague at Stanford, James Zoe, who has a process for debiasing this. They are able, he and his team are able to pull out this sexist string and leave the rest of the words in their appropriate associations in vector space. So another example we have is legal software. In the US, our courts are too full of people. And to speed up things, the judges use algorithms to decide whether the defendant in front of them should stay in jail because they're extremely dangerous or whether they should be let out on bail. But these algorithms are twice as likely to flag black as opposed to white defendants as being at a higher risk of committing future crimes. And so they're held more often in prisons. And the final example, there are many of them now, is medical. There's a lot of use of algorithms and machine learning in medicine. One of the cool things that has happened is that this group here has discovered that using imaging, algorithms can diagnose skin cancer as well as physicians can. So you could find out immediately if you have a skin cancer, if you have something you're suspicious about with this kind of imaging, you can find out right away. However, this data set of 129,000 images is dominated by European Americans, so lighter skin, and it contains very few images from people with darker skin. So the question is still open whether or not this program will work as well on people with darker skin, because it was trained, the whole process was trained on people with lighter skin. So these are things that can be fixed if we're aware it's something that we can fix. So the solutions, gendered innovations is solution driven, and the solutions to these kinds of problems require interdisciplinary teams of computer scientists, lawyers, political scientists, historians, gender experts, and the like. And at Stanford, we're just founding an Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, and those teams look just like this. We have collected everybody from across the university, and I'm very pleased as a gender expert to be in on the ground floor. To look at all of these things, we had a workshop on machine learning at Stanford in March, and what we wanted to do was to identify in the machine learning where the bias is. Mostly it's in the data, sometimes in the predictive models or the algorithms, and we wanted to map the solutions. And then we want to discuss this question of who should be involved in making the decisions about fixing the problems. Because we now want to have the algorithm return what we call fairness or equality or everything that's good, but who's defining that then? Everybody loved algorithms because they were objective, they were neutral, no politics involved, right? So everybody loved them. But we now know that obviously they're capturing the biases, which are human biases, and returning them, amplifying those biases and returning them to us once again. So now who should make the decisions about what is fair? Is it the computer scientists themselves? If so, we need to do something about their education so that they get social science and humanities and ethics and all that stuff. Should it be teams of ethics? That gets a little, or should it be government oversight committees? So we do need to have some kind of gatekeepers, people who will make sure that our technologies are operating in the way that we want them to and not somehow harming society. Now we're going to shift gears and go to the robots. So in January, I'm on sabbatical this year, so I had lots of activity going on. So in January, we had a workshop on gender and robotics. And here we wanted to think about gendering robots. Why do people feel the need to attribute gender to robots? People like to gender stuff, right? If you have a baby, you want to know right away, is it a boy or a girl? I mean, this is just what we want to know, and we gender our stuff. So is gender, then there's this issue, is gender domain specific? Is a woman's voice ideal for dating advice, which many people think, or is a man's voice ideal for math tutoring? What is it that genders a robot? Then we were also interested in gender and emotional intelligence. What is appropriate social touch between robots and humans in relationship to the gender of the person versus the gender, so perceived gender of the robot? And then research shows that humans often harass robots. Poor Siri on your iPhone. Poor Siri is terribly harassed. whether you know it or not, Apple is recording absolutely everything you say to Siri, and they analyze it. I would love to have that data. But so Siri is just terribly harassed, and she does sometimes get marriage proposals as well. So I guess she's loved and she's hated. So then we want to know how all of this behavior influences the relationship between humans, because however we treat humanoid robots is going to have something to do with how we treat other humans. And finally, can we design socially responsible robots? That was our goal. So the challenge to designers, to robotic designers, is to understand how gender becomes embodied in robots and to design robots that promote social equality rather than social inequality. Robots are designed in a world alive with gender norms, gender identity, and gender relations. And humans, whether designers or users, tend to gender machines because in human culture, gender is a primary social category. Many robot designers and specialists in human-robot interaction argue that the human tendency to gender robots helps users engage more effectively with the robots. This is called the matching hypothesis. If the robot matches your expectations, many designers feel that you'll have an easier time cooperating with the robot or interacting with the robot. But there's a danger here. As soon as the users assign gender to a machine, stereotypes follow. Similarly to what I just discussed in machine learning, the danger is that gendering robots may reinforce gender inequalities by hardening current stereotypes. So designing hardware toward current stereotypes may amplify those stereotypes into the future. So let's look at what genders a robot. Here's a little robot, Pepper. It's a Japanese robot. So what do you think this robot's gender is? If we look first at the color, many designers will give you a cue. They will give you a pink or a blue cue to get you to imagine what the robot is. It doesn't take much to get you to think it's a masculine or a feminine robot. And if there are no cues, we in Western culture have a masculine default, so we see it as masculine. So there's color, there's the voice. Of course, the voice is full of cultural information. The pitch of the voice, if it's a synthetic voice, the pitch indicates whether it's a male, female, or a child. Lower voices in our culture carry authority. For example, Margaret Thatcher, who was the first woman prime minister in the UK, was trained by a vocal coach from the National Theatre to lower her voice to make it more authoritative. So there's a lot of cultural politics and power in voices. And many of the assistive robots use a childish voice because this is seen as non-threatening. A lot of the assistive robots have childish faces, which I was interested to learn means a small chin and large eyes, because this is all non-threatening. It's very friendly. So if we look at the name of this robot, Pepper, it's a pretty nicely non-gendered name. The designers call him a he, but the name is fairly gender neutral. The only Pepper I know of is from the Iron Man films, right? Gwyneth Paltrow was the assistant Pepper, so that gives it kind of a female twist, I guess. And then I find the anatomy of this robot very confusing, right? The designers are calling it a he, but look at that cinched waist. And it is Japanese, so, you know, traditionally Japanese men wear these kind of skirt-like things, so, but I don't know. If I were just looking at it, it would not be saying he to me at all. And then there's the personality. Different personalities are so designed into the robot. But here's the kicker. A lot of the social critics. So at this workshop we had, one of my friends who looks at racial identity was looking at the blue eyes. And she was saying, okay, why are all the robots white and why do they all have blue eyes? I think it would be very easy to choose an eye color which is outside the human palette so that we're not fitting into our ethnic stereotypes, I guess. So Pepper's eyes actually change from blue to green. I think when he's not paying attention, they're green, and when he's paying attention, they're blue. But again, I think we could just step outside the human palette for that. Here's another robot I like, Valkyrie. So have a look at Valkyrie. Okay, is this a male or a female robot? Male? Oh my, no. Look at the cleavage. I mean, seriously. Now, Valkyrie is kind of interesting. It's NASA's superhero. It's a rescue robot, so it goes into dangerous situations and rescues people and things. But the design, so NASA's line, it's a government organization in the US, is that it's gender neutral. There's no gender at all. But the designer had a 7-year-old daughter, and he wanted to make a robot that would inspire his daughter. So he specifically put a female robot into this rescue space, right? And that's kind of playing around with stereotypes because you expect some big, strong male to be going in and rescuing things. So instead we have a big, strong female robot. So Valkyrie, of course, is a Norse set of goddesses. And he very specifically designed this to inspire his 7-year-old daughter. So to get the form right, which I agree, it's a very masculine form, but to get the form right, they brought in a French physicist turned fashion designer to help with the overall appearance and style. That's where my tax dollars are going. And so even though, and then they put on these breasts, they said they had to load extra equipment into the front, but you don't have to give it cleavage. I mean, seriously. So it's an interesting one. And again, we have the Iron Man kind of image there. Now, I was very happy to find these robots, which are customized around ethnicity. It's the only example I found by roaming around on the web of anything that had a choice. You can choose by ethnicity. This is a robot for autism, and they're only males made for, this is Milo, and only the male robot is available. So I'm not sure what the designers will have in mind for the millions of girls who suffer from autism as well. I know that autism more often impacts boys, but there are many girls also. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting that Milo is available in a variety of skin color. So what we were trying to, what the roboticists and the gender experts came up with in our workshop is that there are at least 6 options that designers can think about when they're designing a robot. They can challenge current gender stereotypes, and I think that's a very good thing. They could design customizable robots where the user can pick and choose the details, so you could make it look and feel the way you'd like to. You could design a genderless robot. I think we have some examples of that. You could design a gender fluid robot, and I have absolutely no idea what that means at all. You could step out of human social relations, and the Japanese do that a lot. They have a robot which lifts people in hospitals, and they've made that a big blue teddy bear. So they've just stepped out of human relations altogether. Or you can design a robot-specific identity, which again tries to bypass human social stereotypes. So I'm trying to develop this virtuous circle for roboticists. We know that we all live in a culture which is full of gender norms. Designers have this opportunity to challenge those gender norms. The robots can embody gender norms that promote equality. This will influence users, and hopefully it will change our culture then to loosen up the gender norms that we have. So I want to just give, I think I'll stop so we can have a few questions. I just want to give this last example here, and this is now, it's a French designed robot, but now the Japanese have acquired it. And what's interesting is the rules for touching. This experiment found that the rules for touching are the same for robots and for humans. So this is exactly my worry, that however we treat the robots, this sloshes over into the human world because we're applying all the human rules to our interaction with robots. So this is an anatomy lesson, and the human subjects were asked to touch Now in different places on Now's body. And when humans were asked to touch the buttocks and the genitalia, they had a increase in heart rate, and they became uncomfortable, I guess. So it was measured that way. It's the same response you have if you're asked to touch humans in what are called inaccessible areas. Well, I want to point out that Now has absolutely no genitalia whatsoever. So we're just imagining that Now is part of our culture and that the same rules. I was interested to find that there are very clear rules about how we can touch each other. In general, women are allowed to touch more in our culture than men are. Both women can touch men and women more in more places. Arms are very accessible, shoulders are very accessible, and then the rest of the body becomes much more inaccessible. So all of these rules that we all know but don't really articulate are also true of the robots. So I'm going to stop there. There's lots of things we could discuss, but I'd like to hear from you.
So, questions, comments, reflections?
I want to say, if you're interested in this kind of research, you can join our listserv. Only I send an email, and only about once a month, and it's only research in the area of sex and gender analysis in research. It's not about equality or any of the many other issues.
Thank you, that was really interesting. I found it interesting as well that you introduced yourself as being assertive and then mentioned that it's not commonly seen as a feminine trait, because it's probably one of the best examples of a masculine trait. And it's fascinating that with robotics, and we see in coding as well, that these fields seem to be a bit more progressive with attempting to change gender norms. Through your case studies, and also in health and medicine, it seems that the focus is on gender differences to highlight the differences between the sexes in research. Have you found through your case studies, are some fields more resistant to gendered analyses, and are some fields better at using disaggregation to highlight the commonalities and remove stereotypes that way?
Well, you bring up a very important point. We should emphasize difference and sameness, right? So if I had more time, I would show you our sex analysis, where you see that the story is that there are extremes. There's the more male end of the bell curve and the more female, but the two curves overlap. So overlap is a very important thing. So I wouldn't say, so engineers just haven't discovered this field yet. They don't think about gender. It's not in their curriculum. It's not that they're resisting. They just haven't got a clue, really. I think medicine is where this field was most developed. Our very first case study was on heart disease. That's such a well-known example of women being left out. And then we did osteoporosis, where men had been left out. So I don't think we find so much resistance these days as just benign neglect, which I guess is a kind of resistance. So people have not been educated. We have to get it into the medical curriculum. We have to get these kind of analytics into the engineering curriculum so that our research is excellent, right? We come out with the right information at the other end.
Hi, I'm Richard Inley. I just loved the talk. It made me think about some of the research I've been doing. I've been doing some rehabilitation trials, and we've been trying to move from unblinded assessment to blinded assessment. But the one thing that your talk has created is just a slight worry that there might be some gender biases and expectations depending on the gender of the blinded assessor compared to the participant that if we're asking, how are you doing? Quality of life questions.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Should I be worried?
I would be very worried. I would not sleep a wink tonight. Yeah, so I think pain is one of the best examples. This isn't something I work on, and I don't know much about it, but I do know that it depends on the gender of the physician and the gender of the patient in that interaction, because male physicians may have certain assumptions and female physicians may have certain assumptions in the way they listen and what they hear. And I do know, and then men and women express their pain differently. So the upshot that I have heard is that in the end, the men will be sent home with pain tablets, for better or for worse. I'm not sure that's the right answer either. But the women will be referred on to psychological help, right? So we do make assumptions. The willingness of people to talk to you and to divulge information will very much depend on the match or the mismatch of expectations on both sides. So I'm not sure exactly how you deal with that. I'm sure it's been studied and you can find some good stuff. But you might want to have teams asking questions or something, I don't know. But yeah, very much something you would want to take into account.
So perhaps the last question, because I know Anushka, because we do need to whip Londa off to a next talk, but I just want to also make some concluding remarks.
I'll be quick, thank you. Very much enjoyed that. Just wanted to, you touched on it a couple of times in your presentation. There's obviously a strong interaction with culture and particularly I was interested in the scale that you developed. You mentioned issues around representation, etc. But even within North American, Australian, Western Europe societies, there's lots of heterogeneity now. Did you look at that, and how did that affect your scores?
Yeah, so in our survey, we collected income levels, we collected ethnicity, we collected zip codes, so we know what part of the country you're from. So we collected all those things, and we can correlate all those things. I think it's very difficult to take the complexity of gender as it is expressed in all the different cultures and get any kind of variables that make any sense at all. But your choice is leaving this out completely. So I feel that we're just at the beginning of this sort of thing, and we would definitely want to, I don't know if you'd even have to have a different set of variables for different ethnicities, for instance. It's really so complicated. But we have to get to the cultural aspects of health. We just have to. I don't think I need to tell anyone here that.
So I am going to draw the meeting to a close, and firstly, just Londa, thank you.
Yes.
Obviously, it's not just the mice and men story that is of interest, but there's also the male death, male-induced death, which some of us can tell you about, which is interesting, to say the least. But look,
but only of C. elegans.
Oh well, yeah. Well, so thank you, Londa. It really is quite stimulating. I think, obviously, Richard, as you pointed out, it raises a number of questions for the research we do, and that's part of the point of bringing Londa out here. The meeting that we had yesterday, we had representatives from some of the major funding organisations, obviously NH and MRC, representatives of some of the leading Australian medical journals. We had the Australian ABS and others in the room. There's no doubt there was consensus about this is an issue that is really important for Australia and that we need to address it. And I think those of us who were at the meeting yesterday realised that people saw that the George could be a leader in this area. A lot of enthusiasm. One of the attendees who came yesterday has already emailed me and said, hey, look, I think we could put in an ARC grant together to look at how we can move this along further and really do a lot more. So a lot of enthusiasm from the group that we had yesterday to really push some of the issues that Londa's raised, that she's been at the forefront of documenting in terms of the North American experience and the European experience. So it really has been quite a stimulating session that we've had. And I think perhaps useful to point out, we were very mindful yesterday we didn't have Mark Woodward or Sonna Peters in the room, who've led a lot of our sex and gender research, but Mark and Sonna have appointed, or Mark, using funding that he's got from his program grant, he's appointed both Cheryl and Carolyn to be sex and gender coordinators within the Institute, across the Institute globally, to really support staff within the Institute to look at their data and think about the sorts of things that you've raised, Richard, so that we can do better research. And ultimately, this is what it's about. While some of us have a bias in terms of improving the health of women, fundamentally, this is about improving the health of both men and women, and we made that very clear in the discussions we've had yesterday as well. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all for coming along. Really go and look at the website. It's fascinating, and I'm sure over time Cheryl and Carolyn will be linking in with many of you to encourage you to think about the research you've been doing and how that your research might change moving forward. So thank you all, and thank you again, Londa.